Hi and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kumi Vikramanayaka, co-chair of AIADC Urban Design Committee and architect at Winsec Associates here in Washington, D.C.
Hi everyone, I'm Janki Shah. I'm co-chairing Urban Design Committee along with Kumi. I'm a design professional at HKS, also in Washington, D.C.
So on behalf of AIADC and the Urban Design Committee, I would like to welcome all of you for today's panel discussion, Culture Amplifier, Spaces for Multicultural Exchange. Today's event would not have been possible without the generous support of our committee sponsors, BBB Architects and Planners and HKS Architects. Culture Amplifier is a two-part event consisting of an ideas design competition and an interdisciplinary panel discussion. Last November, we successfully hosted the ideas design competition in partnership with the Asian American Designers Union. And we are all gathered here today for the part 2 of the event, the panel discussion, where we will further discuss the role of culture in our built environment. In the past, cities were often direct manifestations of their culture. The ability to conduct civic gatherings, the exchange of ideas and values, and cultural celebrations reflected in the public realm and in the programming of the urban fabric. During the 21st century, we have experienced unprecedented global integration, which has fueled economic opportunities and brought with it many other benefits. But it has also started to diffuse cultural identity in cities. So is cultural identity still relevant in a globally diverse city? To the design competition and the panel discussion is both trying to explore ideas surrounding how can we as designers create new or adapt existing public spaces to express their individual and collective voices. Can we design spaces that can contribute towards informal citizenry that promotes awareness on culture, ethnicity, and identity? Few of the challenging questions that we wanted to discuss through both the competition and today's panel discussion are, how can we find a balance preserving places for existing cultural identities while allowing for new ones? And how do we create places for cross-cultural exchange? Can urban design support tolerance and understanding between different cultures? And how can we look at culture and identity through the lens of equality, inclusion, and diversity? So after reviewing and evaluating the entries we received, 2 proposals were selected to be showcased in the AIADC website as well as during the panel discussion today. The winning entry, DC Space, was submitted to us by Aaron Grainer and Rishika Dhawan. DC Space is a community pop-up that will serve as a communal living room. This relaxed, free-to-enter space will strengthen community bonds between varying groups and create a context where all generations can coexist in an atmosphere of play. It will provide a place where people can build interpersonal networks that are critical to creating thriving and resilient neighborhoods. Proposed for the Columbia Heights neighborhood, this design proposal takes into account aspects such as construction, operations, and maintenance. According to the judges, some of the strengths of this proposal were that it's a replicable model that can be configured according to a specific community or culture's need. They felt that the conceptual idea, the community living room, is a simple yet powerful idea that mimics the function of a coffee shop or a third place. Additionally, judges mentioned that visualization of potential kit of parts for various DC spaces in various neighborhoods would have made the proposal even more strong. The runner-up entry submitted to us by Rita Wu themed around the reconstruction of open spaces in Washington, D.C. Chinatown. This submission explored the possibility of promoting cultural engagement and interaction using public infrastructure, a bus stop. Rita explored the possibility of giving the bus stops in the Chinatown area an entirely new appearance that symbolized the Chinese culture. In her proposal, the freestanding bus stops are further complemented by the addition of mini gift stores, food stores, and kiosks to attract more people to this otherwise mundane public infrastructure and make the waiting time more fun and comfortable. According to the judges, some of the strengths of this proposal were that it was very imaginative and very culture specific, and how the proposal boldly takes on the clear approach to DC's and other cities' challenge of a diminishing, less authentic Chinatown. However, one of the comments brought up by the judges were how this proposal can be achieved while maintaining meaning and authenticity. Amplifying visual iconography alone won't save the decreasing importance of DC's Chinatown to the rapid disperse of the Chinese American community. You can find out more about these two winning proposals using the AIA DC Virtual Showcase website. A link to the exhibition will be posted on the chat shortly. On that note, I would like to invite my co-chair for AIDC Urban Design Committee, Janki Shah, to introduce the panelists for today's discussion.
Thank you, Kumi. So introducing our first panelist is Jamie Anderson. Jamie is known as a tenacious advocate for cultural institutions and their communities. 30 years ago, she was introduced to the museum field through an internship that launched a career of planning, designing, and championing museums, their collections, and audiences. Jamie has held positions at Smithsonian Institution, the National Gallery of Art, and at Smith Group, where today she leads the firm's cultural practice across its offices, nationally and internationally. A balance of practice, design, and teaching, Jamie's career and portfolio has continuously focused on cultural institutions. She has held nearly every role in and around museums and galleries over the last 30 decades, including nearly 13 years as a senior architect, exhibit designer at National Gallery of Art. Some of her notable projects include the National Museum of American Indian, Museum of Pop Culture in New York City, Gilcrease Museum of American History and Art, and the renovation and expansion of the Franklin Institution. Welcome, Jamie. Our next panelist is Charles Springbaum. Charles is the president and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation. Prior to creating the Cultural Landscape Foundation, he spent 15 years as a coordinator of National Park Service Historic Landscape Initiative and a decade in private practice in New York City with a focus on cultural landscapes and urban design. In his career, he has authored and edited numerous publications, including The Modern Landscapes, Transition and Transformation, Shaping the American Landscape, Design with Culture, Preserving Modern Landscape Architecture, and the forthcoming Experiencing Olmsted. Additionally, he was a Loeb Fellow of Harvard's GSD and a Rome Prize recipient. He was awarded ASLA's La Gaze Medal in 2008, President's Medal in 2009, and the ASLA's Medal, the Society's highest honor in 2018. He was also the recipient of the Garden Club of America's Historic Preservation Medal and Lenzan International Landscape Honor Award in 2020. Charles also served as a lecturer in landscape architecture at Harvard's GSD. He's also been a visiting professor at Columbia University and Ohio State University. Welcome, Charles. Our third panelist for today is Leslie Howardton. She's an associate director for urban design at DC Office of Planning. She oversees the urban design division, whose mission is to bring an explicit urban design focus to the District of Columbia. Building on the distinct character of the nation's capital, combined with a deep understanding of the human experience in order to shape great neighborhoods, building, and public spaces. Leslie has partnered with diverse community and private clients on commercial corridors, vibrant urban waterfronts, and downtown revitalization across the country. She's highly skilled in collaborating with stakeholders to achieve a common vision and lead communities through the planning process. Leslie has over 20 years of experience in architecture, urban design, and planning professions. Prior to joining the Office of Planning, her career included work for for firms and organizations as Torquay Gallus and partners in Silver Spring and Gensler in Washington, D.C., and most recently, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in both Montgomery County and Prince George's County, Maryland. Her work ranges from architectural design of residential and mixed-use building types of various scales, small and large-scale master planning projects for new and existing communities, urban design and public space projects, including the development of design guidelines and streetscape standards to strategic regional planning and regulatory design review. Welcome, Leslie. Our final panelist for today is Thomas Lee. Tom is decidedly thoughtful leader with a pure passion for design. He brings a unique ability to consider and coalesce differing perspectives, which has helped studios thrive through many evolutionary shifts. Tom's steady, even-keeled influence has been the key to long-term cultivation of client relationships of all kinds around the world, including many in mainland China. From Shanghai and into Northeast and South China, he spearheaded the design of large-scale cultural facilities that defy precedents. His projects there include numerous performing arts centers, museums, and theaters, all of which enrich community and celebrate local cultural nuances. Some of his notable cultural projects are Shanghai's International Dance Center and Shanghai's JK's Art and Cultural Center. Growing up in first-generation immigrant family from mainland China gave Tom an appreciation for how different people live and an understanding of where they are coming from. One of his roles in studio's leadership is to assimilate information from different point of view and find directions from that. Welcome, Tom. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us. We are very excited for having this conversation with you. So we'll begin the conversation asking questions that draws out high-level theme and trends. We'll also take up questions from the audience and post it if it's relating to the theme. But we also have a separate 10-minute session to answer questions from our audiences. So please feel free to add questions in the chat. So to begin the panel discussion, the first question we would like to pose is on the theme of neighborhood in transition. So often when we talk about global cities like New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., they all have established cultural footprints and brands. But they are also made up of diverse and evolving neighborhoods and local communities that have unique and easily recognized characteristics that when we take collectively make the cities truly unique. In the context of neighborhood in transition, how can we celebrate local cultural identity that considers the evolving social structure of local communities while avoiding gentrification and displacement?
Okay, well, everybody's just being really shy here, so I guess I'll just sort of jump in here. First of all, thank you for those introductions, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues today. I think there's a number of different ways to answer this question, but I want to begin by pulling out the word celebrate and the word authenticity. Our communications director, Nord Wennerstrom, has banished the word celebrate from our messaging because it is so amorphous and mushy that it just really doesn't have a lot of meaning. And I can't help, well, when this question is posed in terms of global cities like Washington, D.C., you began talking about Chinatown, and I've lived here long enough to see it sort of shrink to what a colleague of mine calls the China block, you know, with Chinese signage on CVS and Starbucks and symbols on tree grates and now bus shelters. The reality is when it's gone, it's gone. And so I want to answer this sort of twofold. First, through the lens of the economist Don Ripkema, who is a great leader in the historic preservation field. And one of the ways that he would look at this question would be the idea of looking at sense of place, sense of identity, sense of community, sense of ownership, and sense of evolution. And I think this idea of evolution really is core to authenticity because one has to understand where they've come from to understand where they're going. And I think one of the challenges that we have, and I think this is across disciplines, is how do we get away from this sort of bastardized theme park approach to the built environment? And how do we begin first and foremost by listening to those that are there, those that have been pushed out of there, and those that are the sort of stewards and kinkeepers for those communities before form giving, before the planning, the landscape architecture, the urbanism all takes place. And to me, it is that quest to understand those origins. And the last thing I just want to say about this topic, as someone who's rooted in both landscape architecture and historic preservation, is I think that when we think about authenticity, at the core is the concept of integrity of setting, integrity of place. And I think very often as designers, if you will, we don't elevate the idea of feeling and association and what that means. And when does a place like Bourbon Street or Nashville hit that tipping point because of having to absorb, 10 million or more tourists a year? Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Would any of the other panelists would like to add anything to this topic?
Sure, I would just like to add one tidbit to what Charles just explained, and that is, of course, the notion of storytelling, which can really be deep-rooted in a local heart of a community. And of course, we design around places where people gather, but people gather in specific places sometimes because of stories that, evolve over time or are hidden over time. And so, that notion of what the histories are, the stories are really deeply rooted in kind of harnessing what makes a locality or a community or a neighborhood unique. And I think, for the most part, both finalists in the competition kind of highlighted not just a little bit of storytelling, but also that notion of where people gather. One, of course, manufactured a little gathering, and the other tried to utilize a place where people in a mundane way sort of haphazardly gather to sort of amplify a little bit of a sense of place. And so that perspective was really interesting. And then in addition, tagging on to a little bit of what Charles mentioned as well, we feel, and it's so crucial not to just launch right out the gate with design or with an immediate solution when you come across, a place or a group or a gathering location, but instead to really get the perspective of the people who will be utilizing this, or the value of the residents and the folks and the storytellers from the specific neighborhood. Because looking outside of ourselves, if you will, and beyond ourselves to really engage with. And I think we'll touch a little bit on that a little bit later today. But for me, it's storytelling and gathering and the voices of the community that really amplify the unique nature of a specific location.
Both those, Jamie, that's great. And the same to Charles, your comments are really well taken. I think for us in our work, we often try to understand the context in which we do our work, whether it's public places or private developments that have a public commitment of creating place. And I think, when I hear Charles say, DC's Chinatown is shrinking, we're having similar, I'm based in San Francisco, we're having similar issues with, Little Italy in San Francisco, Chinatown here, the Mission, and a lot of these, we have to remind ourselves as designers that we need to work in concert with city leaders, business leaders, because of socioeconomic context in which we work. Chinatown, San Francisco needs to recover. I imagine DC is the same, and a number of other ethnic communities in around the Bay Area and New York, and many cities around the country need to go through that. So we as designers don't control the broader economic forces, but to deal with this gentrification that comes into play when when an area like a Chinatown starts to shrink, developers come in and they see opportunities to develop property and to make profit, et cetera. And I think we need to be conscious of working with local businesses, local leaders to reinforce their economic standing, and how looking for ways in which they can improve that standing to reinforce those genuine characteristics which Jamie so eloquently mentioned, so they can have a place. It's leveraging their strengths, and then a lot of these places, a lot of these ethnic cultural neighborhoods need to leverage their strengths, and it comes partly through economic opportunity and partly through social voice and social consciousness about the integrity of who they are and what their neighborhoods represent.
I think I
would just add. Oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
Leslie. Sorry, go
Sure.
ahead.
No, I would just add. I agree with everything that everybody said on the panel. I think, and it was said very eloquently. And as someone, in the local government, and looking at what our role is, and this sort of gets to a question we may touch on later about engagement. Jamie alluded to it with storytelling, is really starting the process off by bringing, as a local government, we're here to bring people together and communities together so that we do understand who we are planning and designing for, that I think Charles talked about as well, and about, it's really important to involve the people who live and work in these places in the process, giving them a voice, making them a part of the process, in designing, planning or designing for, whatever is to come, but also more importantly in understanding the history and culture of their place and where they came from. And the storytelling reminded me of the community walks. One of the tools that we use is community walks at the beginning of each of our projects, where we're going into, we're looking at a new small area plan in one of our neighborhoods or our wards. And we always start off by sort of that community mapping, that community walks, and getting out there and going to the people where they are to understand what's important to them and to understand their place, and to understand the things that, that aren't working so well as either, and so aren't working so well either. In addition to the things that they love about their place. And so we do a lot of public life studies. Public life studies is one of the ways that we try to understand from the very onset, before we start to plan or design a place, of who the stakeholders are, how do they use their space, how does their space function, what is the history and culture behind their space or their place. And so I think that goes to the sort of the storytelling of the individuals and their lived experiences, but also starts to help us look at planning through an equity lens, and understanding that our engagement processes in the past and even today have specific biases built into them. And so we have started to, create a sort of planning through an equity lens framework when we begin these processes. And so I think everybody said it really a lot more eloquently than I did. And I'm glad each of you touched on the importance of the storytelling and understanding the place before we start to jump in and design and get ahead of ourselves. But I think, also engaging, in your question, when you talk about the evolving social structure of local communities and avoiding gentrification, and when we're talking about redevelopment and infill development in these neighborhoods that a lot of times leads to gentrification, I think, one of the things we've identified in a lot of our public life studies and our plans is really engaging local architects and designers within, and professionals and small businesses within these communities to help plan and design these places as well, because they know them best, versus sometimes we have outside development groups coming in and may not know the history of a place. And so I think that's important as well, making sure that we're creating an economy for local architects and designers within these neighborhoods that live and work there, as well as making sure that we're designing for pedestrians.
I think I have a follow-up question that might maybe apply more to Leslie or Jamie. I'm just curious to know, like in your work, is there a precedents that we can look at and or that you can think of and say, oh, there was an instance where the tourist population or the transient population took more importance than the local community that you were designing in? Or is there have you come across an instance like that?
Well,
Especially-
I would
Go ahead,
Jamie. One thing I would say, that reminds me of a few years ago when we took on the DC Cultural Plan. And that, when you look at the nation's capital, we are the nation's capital, and DC is the largest investor in culture here with the Kennedy Center, the music venues, the museums, and things like that. And one of the questions that we, on the onset, that we had to struggle with in coming up with a DC Cultural Plan that really, we wanted to focus on getting away from the space that is really focused on the national audience, which DC really does, through our museums and around Central Washington and the mall. We tried to create through the DC Cultural Plan and work with communities through engagement and all the stakeholders of how to identify and get down to and recognize the local community. We have 8 wards. We have very authentic and unique neighborhoods of individuals. And a lot of times what's going on in those neighborhoods is overlooked because of the national identity of our nation's capital, and that everything is so focused on the national audience and at the national level. And so that plan, we really came up with recommendations that focused specifically on creators, on public space, on creating resources and facilities for individuals within communities to identify what their culture is and how we can build on that. And so we build on that now through our comp plan, through land use and zoning, through our urban design studies, and through our citywide policy documents that we create. But my point is really just going from sort of always having been focused on this national level and looking at the national audience. And that plan, we really had a tough question and a tough task ahead of us of how to really highlight, focus on, and recognize the individuals and the diverse Washingtonians within each of these neighborhoods that make them so authentic and so unique.
The only thing that I would add to that, from the alternate perspective, right, from the sort of national institutional perspective, is that what's really intriguing is I think, museums and performing arts places like the Kennedy Center and others have sort of had an awakening in the past several years that they do need to reach the local audience, especially here in Washington, D.C. or in the region. And so while, of course, they are centered around a national audience and a national focus, what's been beautiful to see is this highlighting of film festivals and film programs, or jam sessions on the terraces at the Kennedy Centers, or things like that, that are programs that these institutions run in order to keep people coming back again and again, rather than highlighting the only sort of single time visitor. And so I think, whether it's here in Washington, D.C., or whether it's in some of the other, larger cities in the country, or even some of the smaller ones, institutions, cultural districts, cultural places are really looking to amplify not only what brings people in from the outside, but what can make their institution more meaningful for that repeat visitor at home.
Thank you, all the panelists, for answering the question. I think we touched upon a lot of a topic on authenticity, storytelling, history. My next question is for Tom. I want to know from you, how do you measure the success of being culturally sensitive in designing new places? You have done multiple projects, which are museums and library. So is there a tool, or after making the building, how do you measure the success of it?
Well, like a lot of my colleagues here said, when do you start the design process? I think you start the thinking process from the day you meet the client, and it's unusual because much of the work that we've done on the performing arts and stage, pardon the pun, is overseas in mainland China, and I'm American born, so I don't profess to know all the cultural sensitivities and nuances of even my own culture, because it's so vast, and so I think that the starting point there, because in working over there, you're totally immersed in that culture, and you have to sort out the desire to move forward from the desire to remember history and current, where the current people are, where their mindset is, and so on. So I think, and then because that society is fairly top down in a sense, it's less democratic, obviously, than our country. And so the process, one of the things, first thing we had to do is to develop a process to understand and then tease out the things that are the drivers for the design, and which is sort of the kind of the reverse in some ways to working over here, or quite different in a lot of ways. And so I think where we were successful is trying to dig a little deeper into the cultural sensitivities of Shanghai versus Beijing or other cities, and where Shanghai wanted to be in the national scene and the international scene, particularly with two of the last performing arts centers we designed. And then to remind, ironically for me, to remind them that let's not forget the history of some of the great cultural references and qualities of a place like Fengxian, which is south of Shanghai, which is where our more recent performing arts center was done. And so I think in the way we developed the process and how we tested out solutions with the owner, and we offered them lots of options. You can do this, you can do that. Here's how you can reinforce some of the local artisans and local folk cultural thinking and rituals that they had, and so we created these different venues and different options for them to review, and we pushed the client pretty hard to extend the review process beyond just the leadership, and I think that helped us enrich the content of our thinking, and helped us guide through the design process to get something better out of it. And what we've learned from that process working over there, and how it can apply here, is that as designers, we're both advocates and facilitators. And one of the best things we can do in our creative experience is to create a good process before we ever hit the design. The process and how creative can we be? How extensive can we reach out to the audience, beyond just the layer of quote, the client, and how do we dig deeper? How do we extend our understanding to capture things that people might be shy to say? How do we tease that out? How do we get the process designed to allow people to feel like they're comfortable saying what they need to say? So that's a challenge. I think all of us, whether we're in the public sector or the private sector, we need to create a great process to help us facilitate, those directions and that we get from folks we hear along the way.
Thanks, Tom. I think I'm interested to know what Charles would feel like I feel like landscape architecture being even further from like what we can call tangible. How do you, in your experience, think that we can balance and how can we become more culturally sensitive when we are creating public spaces and landscapes within our cities?
Well, just to ground it with a couple of local examples, I mean, Tom may not know that I've been a sub consultant the last couple of years to studios and to Lee and Associates on Fort Lincoln Park.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, if you contrast what's happening at Fort Lincoln Park, for example, with what happened with Pershing Park and Pennsylvania Avenue, and perhaps looking forward with the new Pennsylvania Avenue plan. In all of these cases, there's a narrative history that has to be unlocked. Tom mentioned about being an advocate and a facilitator. And I would say even before that, one has to have a research foundation to underpin the systems that are there. And those systems, as we've talked about, are cultural, but they're also historical. And what's so interesting about Fort Lincoln Park, for example, is a process that began as a typical kind of, we're going to put a new building where there was a terrible bunker-like brutalist building, and we're going to revitalize this park, became a place where studios, for example, have proposed a new structure that all the materiality grows out of a larger narrative structure of the historic resource itself, which triggers all of those emotional feelings and associations that I spoke about earlier. And so that part of the site, per your question about measuring success, has the carrying capacity for new design, whereas the historic core of Paul Friedberg's landscape is now being preserved and rehabilitated in a way that honors the bone structure of that place. Contrast that with Pennsylvania Avenue. We had to become, as Tom just mentioned, we had to put on our advocacy hat so that it wasn't tabula rasa, so the site wasn't nuked. And sadly, the World War I memorial that will ultimately be built there, that was done because the deciders never thought to ask the curatorial question, is and can a work of landscape architecture, can it be significant? And so the response was, no, this is an open space. It looks terrible. We don't want a big fountain. So we can now change that. And I would say that as we look forward in the city and we unlock those stories, for example, in the greater Pennsylvania Avenue, I would have a cautionary word about the future of John Marshall Park as the work of probably one of the first women landscape architects that weren't planting gardens and wearing the white gloves, but the first urban practice by Carol Johnson, who had over 50 employees, who began in the basement of Harvard's hallowed halls because the women were not in the studios with the men. And it's her only significant project outside of the Massachusetts area. And so then the question becomes, how do you manage change in a place like that? Or do you just continue this kind of larger design vocabulary and roll over the fabric that's there today? So it comes back to the question you asked us, how do you measure success? And I would say in each of these cases, we're managing change, and there's a variable scale and a variable set of criteria depending on what makes that place significant.
And Charles, you're right. I mean, it's a lot of it is research, advocacy, and judgment, right? About what is valuable in a broader sense, not just monetary or economic value. The historical resource you're pointing to, and especially in DC, right, which is a critical part of any design process. I think when you see how you can mix in retention of these important resources and how they can dovetail with new, they can coexist, and I think that's a great measure of successful projects. Which has been our experience. Working overseas, the measure. Because in China, for example, it's so easy. I'm trying to dominate the conversation here, but it's easy for the Chinese to say, progress means clearing out, right? And it doesn't have to be the case. And I think one of the things we try to advocate for with our clients is that you can capture valuable portions of the physical environment and incorporate it into a new design so that in a way, it's a more sophisticated and a better outcome. And I think that's something that's very difficult in China, which is very progress oriented, especially in the last 10, 15 years.
I think my next question is for Leslie. I want to know from you, what is the role of policy that could play in achieving or measuring success? Or if in your work tenure, have you experienced or have you worked through any of those policy or advocated for those policy?
I think, in terms of what does success look like or achieving sort of the balance from a policy perspective, having been on both the private sector and public sector side, one, understanding sort of the history of our most beloved places and why, they were beloved by people, and in terms of, mainly they were achieved through incremental development over time. Most of the places that we can all think of that we love and that we identify with, they were. And when we start to talk about and bringing in, new larger developments, I think the relationship of the built environment and the public realm becomes really important. That relationship between the detail of a building, building a building to a street to a neighborhood, that there is some kind of ensemble or composition that resulted to create, an identifiable memory of a lovable place. And so I think, when we try to sort of manage this balance between new and old, and what Charles talked about in terms of managing change, I think it does go back to ensuring that we know and understand as much as possible who we're designing for and why, from a policy perspective, when we're looking at our small area plans. Should we be intervening here at all? And also, taking a deep dive into the history and the culture of the place, as we talked about earlier, and understanding, what culture is to the people that live and work and visit there. It's also about the ins and outs of how a place works and functions. And that's where I go back to, we spend a lot of time before we do a lot of planning work doing public life studies and understanding place, understanding how people use space. And then that sort of translates into sort of your question of how do we achieve this a balance from a policy standpoint. I think that's where, from a public sector kind of local government perspective, we start to get into, development review. As we review private sector developments that come in, we look at regulations, we develop, policies, regulations, and guidelines. And I think through, a series of, community input and participation, in private development through the use of the guidelines that we create, such as our public realm design manual for the district, our streetscape guidelines, even our IZ and the public benefits model that is specifically put in there to make sure that benefits go back to the communities that live there, and through the cultural plans. This is a way that we can help guide sort of new development that's not as incremental and built over time as it was in our older cities. And it's a way to manage it and provide guidance to the private sector. But I also think there's a fine line there too, having come from the private sector, where too much regulation and too much guideline can get in the way and stifle creativity and innovation. And I think we have to be careful of that. And make sure that the expertise from our development community, our architects, our designers, our landscape architects, our historians, that is coming through. And so that we're not being too prescriptive, but policy, I think, should provide some guidance so that we can achieve a balance as best we can between new and old, while still, retaining that authenticity or that cultural heritage of a place and its people in the community, that new people in the future that come into the place can learn from as well.
If I might just add just a small nugget to that, I really want to amplify the word transparency here, because I do think that being a component of any design process for the public is just so hugely important. And what we do sometimes is early voting and prioritization with the user group or with the local residents or the public, to make sure that we set the standards early in a project and then continuously go back and measure against those things that, not the designers, but that the people who will be utilizing the space have decided are the priorities. And the last thing I just wanted to highlight here is the level of responsibility that we have as designers, because we are basically the megaphone between them and the municipality or the locality government sometimes, and at times there's a little bit of friction there and there's a little bit of mistrust. And so we have to, as designers, be very clear of the fact that we are in many cases representing people, and make sure that the level of transparency is open and available, so that everyone can see everything that goes on. And yes, sometimes that makes the municipality or the policymakers a little grumpy with us as designers, but it's important for us to be able to not just sort of check a box when we're doing engagement, but to really stand for and with the communities for and with which we are designing.
Thanks, Jamie. I think an overarching theme, if I'm like going through the whole discussion, is community engagement and making sure that the community that we're designing in, that their voices are heard. And going back to what you initially spoke about, the aspect of storytelling, and kind of tying it into what you just said, how can we, like, what are the methods that maybe we can use to effectively gain more civic engagement? Or is there like tools and like methods that you can use to kind of like get the community more excited and get them to engage themselves with the planning and planning process?
What's intriguing for me is that I've never had a problem finding people who want to tell their opinion. And so it's a matter of meeting people where they are. And so having a diverse menu of engagement opportunities. And it goes beyond just like, what schedule are you going to use, or what venue are you going to use, but making sure that you are giving as many options as possible for as many people as possible to render, their judgment and their opinion. In addition, and I think Charles and Tom both spoke to this a little bit also, is like tapping into those local resources, historians, researchers, archivists, artists, advocates, community organizers, to really kind of utilize networks to find and to discover the most people as possible are really great methods. Also partnering with local designers, partnering with people who live in and value, the community. And then the last thing I'd like to highlight is youth. We find extraordinary innovation, creativity, and perspective from young people. And when you really think about the places that we design, it's not, going to be for me and my generation mostly, but for young people. And so visiting middle schools and high schools, which can sometimes be really scary because, you're dealing with young people who have no filter between what they, want to tell you, but it's extraordinarily exciting to glean the perspective of young people and, work with them to find out what a future space might be.
Charles, can you?
Sure, I just want to jump in here because I think one of the things that many of us are talking about, and I have to say I want to go on Leslie's community walks now, is this idea of giving ample time for discovery. My experience from having been a consultant, both independently and then more recently through the foundation, is so often this work begins with SurveyMonkey and those kinds of sort of poo-poo platter menu selections, because the project's been funded for some kind of change. And so it immediately begins with stuff and things, as opposed to having a courtship period. I mean, I also say this as a white dude, if I'm going into a community where I am not from there, I think it's really critical for me to spend time listening and absorbing, and not coming in here with a panoply of ideas of things that we need to affect change. But it's really, I think we have to be generous in front loading these projects with an expanded period for discovery and listening. And we don't do that enough. We immediately get into program. And the great thing about discovery, I'm going to contradict myself from where I started, it is a celebration. It is a place of really to get to know each other. And the last thing I just want to say is, as someone that has taught at a number of institutions, that for me, the joyfulness that ensues from the act of collaboration as a mentor teacher, the good stuff happens when you get to know the students, because then you go on a journey together as opposed to just putting that information out. So I would say to all of us, where we can, to give us more generous time and different tools to gather that information. We have a whole series of opportunities on social media platforms. And I think the idea is really just to discover together and to give that time for that journey.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I would
if I
just
may,
like to add.
okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Thomas. I would just like
Go
to
ahead.
add, I wanted to add on to Charles' comment real quick about, sort of the white dude in the room and it being, having a designer come into these community engagement processes with the community. I think one of the things that's really important for us, because we're speaking for representing communities around the district, is that we really try to make sure that when we go into a community and we're doing a small area plan or a design study, and we are hiring a consultant, design consultant, as well as internally working on these plans, it's important to make sure that the people that come into these communities, planning and design, look like the people that live there. I think that's really important. I just finished a project, a small area plan, and we had a fabulous urban design consultant who I'd partnered with before in private sector. And that was a conversation in terms of logistical, working out the design workshop. The design shred is making sure, and we were doing this virtually, is making sure that the people in the room represent or look like the people that are there in their community. And if they don't, that we supplement that with the staff and the teams that we have here and how we prioritize who is on a team. Because we should be looking like the people that we're representing and designing and planning for. And if not, as Charles said, we have to take the time, the thoughtfulness and the time to do the pre-planning and upfront work, to work with these communities and talk to these communities, to get to know them, to know their lived experience and what their priorities are for their community. It's not just about coming in and planning for the people that don't live there now. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, to understand that when we are planning and designing for communities, that we do our best to make sure that there are people there from the professions that look like and can represent the people that live there.
Exactly. And Leslie, that's exactly right. For us in California, we have the CEQA Act, the California Environmental Quality Act, that we all new developments have to abide under. And so in California, the process is so cumbersome that people get a little jaded with it. And then for us, when we do community outreach for developments, everything that Charles and Leslie and Jamie have said are all principles that we use in terms of the tools and so on. But I think a real simple tool is just the cause and effect. When we meet with community groups, there's a great, in California, people get a little jaded with the process, like I said, and there can be easily distrust the process because it's just, like some people can interpret that as a check the box approach, right? But I think where we've found the most effective ways to get into the community is when they see, we have multiple times when we engage them. And through workshops and so on. And when they see that what they've said hasn't influenced the outcome in some way, we go through the process of understanding what are the priorities, how do we rank them, and how do we incorporate those. And the worst thing we can do is to say, okay, we're just charting out the same plan every time. But if the community feels like they're affecting the outcome, then they own it. And they are then they feel like they're a part of the process, and they got listened to, they got heard, and the outcome is something they can be proud of, and they'll support it. And that's the kind of support we want. It's genuine, real support, not just somebody coming in and say, this is what you need. We need to hear what we need to do for them, and how they can help themselves along the way by giving us valuable input. So this cause and effect is a great way to reinforce trust in the process.
I think, yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Junkie.
No, I was just saying the same thing, that we are almost there on time. We have a question from the audience, and we can try to quickly answer it and then wrap it up. So the question that we have from one of our audience is that many of the panelists have worked in various places across the country or the world. Do you change your design or research approach to address the various identity or authenticities of different places? Or do you use a similar approach in each place with various projects and then let the community engagement or site context help influence your work to be most culturally specific?
I mean, I think I would say from just jumping in, it just popped into my head. From an engagement perspective, we definitely go into, and wherever I've been, whether it was LA or here in private sector or public sector, the first thing I always like to do is understand from each community how they like to be engaged with, how they like to be communicated with. It's sort of going and meeting them where they are. And each community is different. And like we've talked about today, they each have a different culture. And so I like to understand from them how they want to be involved in the process, what's the best way to communicate with them, and how to communicate with them. And in terms of, I think as just as an architectural professional or design professional going through discovery mode and existing conditions, understanding a place, every place is so unique and the people that live and work there are so unique. While I may follow a similar process, I create a series of differing questions as I go through each place that I need to ask. Because so many places are so different. I've worked from California across the country here, and while the general process may be similar, the questions are different and the contexts are so different that your sort of your toolkit as a designer, as someone who's in discovery mode and going through looking at current conditions and the culture and history of a place, you may tease out and find different questions that you need to ask of stakeholders and the community. But certainly in community engagement, I always want to understand how they want to be communicated with, how they want to be engaged with, and what works best for them.
And similarly, whether it's work here, I think through our experiences, there's certain things that we've developed some confidence in our approach. But when we go overseas, we have to be respectful. We have to do our research and understand that when we work in the Middle East, it's different from working in Europe, different from working in Asia and different parts of Asia. And so we have to be good stewards of the information and do our research before we go. And when we get there, you have to be fast on your feet. You have to be adaptive. You have to be smart about, these are questions I had thought might be relevant are not necessarily the right ones to ask. And so I think all of us on this panel have a reservoir of experience that we can draw from, so that we are able to engage in the conversation in as meaningful a way as we can when we're not in our element. So.
Couldn't agree more, Tom. I mean, I think the answer to the specific question is sort of a both. You might have a toolkit or a framework or whatever word you want to use for it, but that gets adjusted based on your team that hopefully is matching, the sense of place and, the whole collective team and the questions and the priorities. But to Tom's last point about adapting, that flexibility is so key, because you learn things and the process itself demands evolution along the way. There may be a surprise that completely turns your perspective or your project on its head, and you have to sort of go in a different direction.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things as well. 2 points. The first, and Thomas was mentioning being abroad. I think here in the US, for example, Native people, African American, there's been a level of disenfranchisement that I think we have to come up with. In addition to having people that are of the place involved, we have to come up with new tools to really make amends and to build bridges. I will say that we're involved in a project right now in Minneapolis, where a lot of folks in the African American community feel like, why should I come to these meetings? They're not going to listen to us. And so there is a lot of healing that needs to be done. And I thought, to end on a note, I think also one of the things I've learned from Gina Ford, the landscape architect with agency, is that fun is really important. That, in all of the work that we're talking about, I think fun is what gets people coming back. So it's not the same 12 people that go to every community meeting, but it's a much broader populace. So I think fun is essential in the work.
Here, here.
Thank you, everyone. I think I feel like 1 hour is like definitely not enough time to discuss everything we have, but we have to wrap it up since it's almost it's past our time. So on behalf of the AIADC and the Urban Design Committee, I would like to take this moment to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the panelists who took time off from their very busy schedules to actually facilitate this discussion. And thank you for accepting our invitation and from about a month ago being in contact with me and Janki and making sure that this became a reality today. I would also like to thank AIADC for logistical support and then for the facilitation of the event, and everyone who joined us for this panel discussion, Culture Amplifier, Spaces for Multicultural Exchange. Finally, today's event would not have been possible without the generous support of our committee sponsors, BBB Architects and Planners and HKS Architects. Please feel free to connect with us using the social media platforms mentioned on the screen or the AIADC website to know more about what the Urban Design Committee is doing. And stay tuned for the future events that we are going to share with every one of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.